So has the Nigerian Naira been devalued? I say yes, and I also say no. Let's talk about it. Hi, folks. So welcome to The Way I See It, which is my podcast on all things personal finance, money, the economy. Sometimes we also do the political economy, but just what we can learn from all that. So this week we have an interesting topic, and it's more or less like a question. So, has the Nigerian Naira been devalued? That's my question today. And the answer is yes and no. So, I'm going to explain what I mean by yes and no. But first thing, let's define a devaluation, just so we know what we're talking about. So, a devaluation occurs when a country has a fixed exchange rate to like a reference currency. Let's take, for instance, the US dollar. So if your currency operates a fixed exchange rate to, say, the US dollar or reference basket of currencies, and your nation reduces the value, the exchange value or the ratio of your currency to that uh, reference currency or basket of currencies, then you've devalued your currency. So for instance, if it was going to be, say, 10 Naira to $1, and you then made it 20 Naira to $1, so you've reduced the number of dollars that you need to buy 1 Naira. So in effect, you've devalued the Naira. That's really what devaluation is. If you give you like a real example, 2020 budget for Nigeria had an exchange rate there of 305 Naira to $1. But as COVID hit and the economy started to unravel, there was a decision to readjust that exchange rate. So the Naira exchange rate then moved up to about 397 to $1. So in effect, official the Naira was devalued more or less from 305 to 397, of course, because of what's going on with the COVID. So that's what a devaluation is. So the question is, last week, the CBN then launched what they call the flexible exchange rate policy. And the implication of this is that the Minister of Finance basically saying that the Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, that the government's transactions that involve the US dollars will now take place using the NAFEX rate, no longer the official rate from the CBN. What this means in terms of the Naira to the US dollar exchange rate is instead of using the 379, which is the official US dollar rate on the CBN website, we're going to move to about 410 or more, which is going to be the NAFEX rate. So we've gone from 379 to 410. And in our example, we said when we reduce the reference ratio, when we increase the amount of Naira we need to buy $1, we have in effect devalued. So when we go from 379 to 410, mathematically, that should be a devaluation, right? But the question is not so. This is the problem. It's not as direct as it is. The Naira has really not been devalued, but it's also been devalued. And that's what we're going to talk about really in this podcast. So, first of all, let's just give you a background to how Nigeria or the federal government, specifically the federation, earns US dollars. And then we can work from there to see why this is not a devaluation per se, but it's also a devaluation per se. Yeah. So, Nigeria's federal government, or in this case, the federation's source of foreign exchange, their primary source of foreign exchange, is a sale of crude oil and gas. Crude oil and gas is priced in US dollars, and Nigeria does export crude oil and gas and then gets paid in US dollars. And it's a simple process. So we have an account, that's the Federation has an account with the NNPC and the CBN at the JP Morgan Bank in the US. So it's the CBN slash NNPC account in JP Morgan that basically collects the sale of crude oil proceeds is paid into that account in the US, and that's paid into that account in US dollars. The CBN will then consolidate all this dollar inflows and then credits the consolidated revenue fund as a Nigerian consolidated revenue fund in Naira. The CBN will receive dollars and then credit the fund in Naira at an exchange rate, i.e. the official exchange rate. So in this case, it's going to credit the CRF, the Consular Revenue Fund, in using the 379, which is the official exchange rate, right? So the CRF, the Consular Revenue Fund, then through the federal account allocation committee, what we call the FAC. That's how the funds are then distributed from the federal to the states and the local government. So the money goes from CBN, NNPC account, and JP Morgan. The CBN then credits the CRF account in Naira at the exchange rate, the official exchange rate. And then the CRF then funds or is then allocated via the federal account allocation committee, the FAC, to the states, the federal, and the local government. This is basically the flow. We earn dollars, we convert to Naira, it's distributed via FAC to the federal and state. So what you then see, or if you follow this, is that if the CBN rate changes, then the amount of Naira that the federal, state, and local governments get also changes. Remember, we're using the 379, which is the official CBN exchange rate. So let's just do an example and see what would happen if we change that rate. What would be the impact? Let's use an actual example. So let's say in 2020, the CBN, or let's say we just assume we did 1 million barrels per day crude oil exports. And let's assume a $50 price, uniform price across the board, for the whole of 365 days. So if Nigeria exported 1 million barrels per day and sold all those barrels at $50 and did it for the whole every single day of the year, 365 days, we will get about 18.25 billion United States dollars. That's what we'll be getting in terms of pure revenue. Let's ignore joint venture costs. Let's ignore production sharing. Just focus on the raw cash, dollar cash that we've gotten from the sale of crude oil and gas. So if we then converted this using the rate at the beginning of 2020, which was not a 397, but a 305, right? Nigeria will then basically be getting 5.58 trillion. So again, if we sold 1 million barrels every day for all of 2020, and we used the 305, which was the initial exchange rate, to convert that US dollars that JP Morgan scooped up for us and put in the bank with the CBN and NNPC account, we would get about 5.58 trillion at 305, right? Okay, what if we did the exact same calculation, but now we used the 379 exchange rate? So we did the same 1 million barrels per day. We sold it at $50 per barrel, and we did it for every single day of the year for 365 days. That figure would then rise to about 6.91. So instead of getting the 5.58, we would now get 6.91 trillion. That's in Naira, because we're using a conversion rate now of 379 instead of 305. That's a difference of almost 1.4 trillion. So by simply touching or amending the CBN official exchange rate, Nigeria gets more Naira, which then means that the CRF and the FAC accounts have more Naira to distribute to the states, the federal, and the local government areas. So what you just can see clearly is this, that a weaker Naira, and by weaker Naira, we mean when we are using 379 instead of 305, is better for FARC or better for the states, federal, and local government because they have more Naira. The CBN will convert that currency or the dollar it receives at a higher rate than the 305, more or less. So a weaker Naira allows the Nigerian government to get more Naira per crude oil barrel of oil sold. A stronger Naira, which is when we sell the crude oil at 305 exchange rate, gives us less Naira. And of course, then gives the CBN and the FARC less Naira to distribute. Keep in mind, when we're doing all this, when the federal government does a budget and has a deficit and cannot meet its revenue obligations in Naira, it normally goes to the CBN, at least in recent years, to get what's called an overdraft, or we might call technically ways and means. Last year, 2020, the total amount of money the CBN borrowed or lent to the federal government was about 2.8 trillion. So the federal government borrowed 2.8 trillion from the Central Bank of Nigeria to meet shortfalls in revenues. That's what we call the ways and means. So the CBN is more or less the banker to the federal government, and it's lending the federal government money. But we've basically seen in our example above that if we simply just changed or simply devalued the Naira from 305 to 379, we get a difference, an additional 1.4 trillion. So clearly, someone must have asked a question. Why are we doing a strong Naira, i.e. 305, and then going to borrow money from CBN, when we can simply devalue the Naira to 379 or more, and then reduce our borrowings from the CBN and also from the local Nigerian bond market and treasury bills market? So it's a good question. And it's following that question, I believe, that the solution to the flexible exchange rate policy now came about. So what the Nigerian state has done is to say the official exchange rate on the CBN website, which is a 379, that has not changed. So the CBN has technically not devalued the Naira. What has changed is the internal exchange rate that the Federation is then using to convert the dollar it earns from the sale of crude oil and gas to Naira. That is what they have changed. They've changed the NAFEX rate, or they're using the NAFEX rate, which is going to be a higher Naira exchange rate of about 410 and could be higher. So from what you can see from the early example, once you change the Naira rate and you make the Naira rate weaker, you get more Naira. So now when we sell crude oil, if we have a billion, for instance, instead of earning 3.79 billion Naira or trillion Naira, more or less, we would then earn 4.10 trillion because we're going to a weaker Naira. And that's really what has happened. So that's why when we ask the question, has the Naira been devalued? No, it has not been devalued because the fixed exchange bands that the CBN maintains, and the CBN is the custodian of the exchange rate mechanism in Nigeria, that has not changed. It's still 379 to a dollar. But internally, the Naira has been devalued when we have the CBN converting the crude oil proceeds in dollars to Naira, which is then going to be shared by the states, the federal, and the local government areas. That's what has changed, and that's going to be a devaluation. The implication more or less is that the market knows this has happened, and the market is going to readjust the street, in quote, to meet up to the new reality. So what you might find is the vendors out there will be like, well, 410 is going to be our new base rate. We won't look at the 379 that the CBN has. But if the federal government is using 410, then we're going to base our exchange rates from 410 and not from 379. So that's basically the answer to our question. Yes and no. But let's just stretch this a little bit and say, okay, will anybody still get 379? Yes, if you are still getting your dollars from the CBN and you are on a concessionary, like you're getting a reduced or subsidy on the exchange rates, maybe like you're a Dangote refinery, petroleum refinery that gets concessionary dollars to build a refinery, you might still get at 379. And that gives you really a good margin because then you're not just buying at a lower rate from the Federation as a private body. You're basically going to build your company or do the imports or do your production at a lower cost because you're buying that Naira or to buy that dollar with lower Naira, which then reduces your overall cost more or less. So I thought it was interesting for us to talk about this and also to introduce us to the concept of devaluation and also how the flows within the Nigerian fiscal space happen. It's quite interesting. If the federal government is now using the 410 or using the market rate, that's called the market rate, and only CBN is using so we say the subsidized rate of 379, that basically tells you what the true and real exchange rate of the Naira is. Is it what the federal government, states, and local governments are using, or is it what the Central Bank of Nigeria is using? Let me say that the market is always right. The market is demand and supply, and the market is always right. So I think eventually you might have to see a realization that the real value of the Nigerian Naira is really not the arbitrary fiat rate, but what the market, the demand and supply equation actually says that it is. All right, guys, let's stop here for this week. Thank you for following us on Twitter. Fin Plan Kalu Aja 1. Do follow, do leave all those questions for us. I appreciate them. And we'll see you guys next week. Share, tell your friends, like us, send us questions. I love it. You guys have a good day. Bye.